Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are pleased to welcome Professor Naomi Baron as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce today's guest. Dr. Naomi Baron is a Professor Emerita of Linguistics at American University in Washington, D.C. She is a leading scholar at the intersection of language, technology, and human communication. Her work explores how we read, write, learn, and think in a rapidly evolving digital world, with particular attention to the interplay between speech and writing, and to the English language. In recent years, her research has increasingly focused on artificial intelligence and its implications for reading and writing practices. A distinguished academic, Dr. Baran is a former Guggenheim Fellow, Fulbright Fellow, and Fulbright Specialist, and has been a visiting scholar at Stanford Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. She is the author of 11 influential books, including Always On, Language in an Online and Mobile World, recipient of the English Speaking Union's Duke of Edinburgh English Language Book Award. Her later works, Words on Screen and How We Read Now, further examine the shifting landscape of reading across print, digital, and audio formats. Her 2023 book, Who Wrote This, investigates how AI-driven efficiency is reshaping human writing, while her most recent title, Reader Bot, turns to the implications of machines as readers. Professor Baran's academic career spans appointments at Brown University, Emory University, and Southwestern University before she joined American University. There she has held several leadership roles, including Associate Dean, Department Chair, and Director of the Threshold Program, as well as Executive Director of the Center for Teaching, Research, and Learning. Her global academic engagement includes teaching and visiting positions in Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, and Italy. A widely recognized voice in public discourse, Dr. Baran's insights have been featured across major media platforms such as CNN, BBC, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, and Time, among others, bringing her research on language and technology to a broad international audience. In today's episode, Professor Naomi Baran shares key insights from her latest book, Reader Bot: What Happens When AI Reads and Why It Matters. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Professor Naomi Baran to the conversation. Professor Naomi, it's a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation.
I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. Professor, your book shifts the focus from AI as a writer to AI as a reader. Why is machine reading the more critical conversation right now?
For the past 3.5 years, there has been growing concern over the abilities of AI to generate text. This was thanks to the launch of ChatGPT and then various other versions thereof. However, it's only been within the last year and a half or so, that people have started to turn their attention to what I call AI as reader. Because AI can summarize a text for you, it can analyze it, it can compare texts for you. And we use this tool in a growing number of ways. People doing research, whether they're professional research scholars or whether they are students, can summarize lots of research articles. But students can also use that same tool of AI as reader to do their reading for them. So when we think about what AI can do through its large language models, it both writes and, of necessity, must first do a version of reading.
Professor, you argue that AI doesn't read the way humans do. What are the most important differences between human reading and machine reading?
To answer that question, it's useful to give a short, very short description of what happens when AI does reading for us. So you have a large language model, which basically is a combination of a huge data set of text plus algorithms. What happens first is that data set of text is broken down into things called tokens, which sometimes are the length of a word, sometimes a little longer than a word. And then the algorithms predict what's likely to be the next token in a string of tokens. We tend to think of words, technically, there are these things that are maybe words, maybe not, called tokens. All right. So what happens when humans read? And then we'll get to the difference with AI. When humans read, they have a purpose, and the purpose is to derive some linguistic sense from what somebody else has written. In the process, when we read, we don't just look at the words themselves in front of us on a page or on a screen, but we also draw in our minds upon other texts that we've read, upon experiences we've had, upon challenges we've faced. That is, reading is an interactive process between that text and other things that are in our mind, sometimes as a result of encountering other texts, sometimes other experiences in our life. There's a direct relationship between the writer and the reader. So think of it this way. There's a human author who produces a text, and then the human being reads that author's texts. What happens when AI reads? The most important thing to know is AI is not in the sense-making business. It has no cognitive purpose. Moreover, there's a mediated relationship, not a direct one, between the writer of a text, a human writer, and an ultimate human reader. So what happens is you have the human author, and as authors' texts have been taken, legally or not, converted into token-sized pieces in the data set. AI as reader using the algorithms to predict the most next likely item, then produces a written text, which a human reader then reads. So you have a number of intermediary steps going on when you're looking at AI as reader. Plus, you have the important thing to understand, namely that AI is not making any sense of what somebody else originally wrote that went into the data set or what it is producing when it produces a written piece for a human reader to read.
Professor, if AI can process and summarize vast amounts of text instantly, what happens to deep reading? The kind that builds reflection, empathy, and critical thinking.
That question has lots of pieces to it, so I'll break it down. The first thing that's important is to look at that term, deep reading. The term was originally used by a literary critic, an essayist named Sven Bierkertz, back in 1994 in a book called The Gutenberg Elegies. What he was describing with that term deep reading is a very different sort of thing than in more contemporary times, which I'll describe in a moment, people mean by the term. What Bierkertz wrote was deep reading is, and I quote, the slow and meditative possession of a book. We don't just read the words, we dream our lives in their vicinity. He was talking about the kinds of thing that sometimes people describe as transportation. You're taken to a different place, to a different level of existence, not the physical place where you happen to be sitting there with a book or a screen. So it's a level of involvement, and that level of involvement could come from a novel. It could come from a really powerful essay, but it's not so much how you're analyzing, but rather how much you're absorbed. This meaning of deep reading contrasts with what the reading specialist and cognitive neuroscientist Marianne Wolf has called deep reading. What she has written is, deep reading is the array of sophisticated processes that propel comprehension and that include inferential and deductive reasoning, analogical skills, critical analysis, reflection, and insight. Often it entails rereading a passage. Almost always it entails stopping and thinking and reflecting on the content of what you have read, which is a very different set of meanings than Bierkertz had in mind. It's also really important that we distinguish between deep reading and so-called long-form reading. Different people have different definitions of what constitutes long form. If you're talking about reading on a screen, people often say 1,000 words is long form. Well, that's about 3 typewritten pages, double spaced. Long form more commonly refers in the literary world to something at least the length of a short story or the length of a novel. Long form reading is not necessarily what either of these people means, that is, Bierkirch or Wolf, means by deep reading. Long form just means it's long. So I could be reading a romance novel, and I'm not particularly transported, and I'm not doing analysis, and I'm not pausing and thinking, but it's long. So I think it's important that we keep those two terms distinct. You mentioned empathy, and that's a really interesting issue when it comes to reading and what we can prove as opposed to what in our hearts we believe about the relationship between reading and empathy. Many people have argued, and I agree, that in the case of many readers, engaging with works, typically fiction, but not necessarily, can produce a feeling of empathy for the characters and perhaps by extension, empathy with other human beings. Research that's been done more recently trying to pin down, can you actually prove that reading generates empathy? It's really hard to do. And it's a long discussion we could go into, but I'll just say we cannot prove it, but we tend to believe it. That said, it's really important to remember that some very, very prolific readers have not been particularly empathetic. Adolf Hitler was a voracious reader, including of novels. So was Joseph Stalin. So we have to be careful before we just automatically say, well, if you are doing a lot of reading, particularly of novels where there are characters that you could empathize with, that will make you a more empathetic person. You cannot count on that. You talked about critical thinking. It was a question I know we're going to come back to in a moment. One of the things I will say at this point is I'm concerned about the breakdown of the amount of reading that in educational settings we're asking students to do. Colleges and universities in the United States spend a lot of time talking about how they are going to teach students critical thinking, to which I answer, if you don't read, what are you going to think critically about? We'll come back to critical thinking.
Professor, are we at risk of outsourcing not just writing, but understanding itself when we rely on AI to read for us?
So let's think about both reading and writing and what individually and collectively they can do for us. If we're doing that reading or writing with any platform, with any degree of seriousness, both reading and writing are opportunities for thinking. When it comes to writing, there have been at least a dozen, probably more, well-known writers who have talked about the connection between writing and thinking. In the United States, one of them is the author Joan Didion, who in an essay in 1976 called Why I Write, rather, she wrote it in 1976. She wrote, I write entirely to find out what I'm thinking, what I'm looking at, what I see, and what it means. Going back many decades earlier, George Bernard Shaw, the playwright, wrote, I don't know what I think until I write it. So it is very well recognized that the process of writing is a mechanism for thinking. The same can be said with a few tweaks about reading, because what reading does is it gives us an opportunity to look at what somebody else, and let's assume for the moment it's a human author, what someone else has said. We can agree, we can disagree, we can formulate alternative perspectives. Back in 1905, Marcel Proust wrote a treatise called On Reading. And in it, he argued very definitively for the importance of doing your own reading before you talk about a work with anybody else, to formulate your own perspective, to agree, to disagree, to know what's in your mind vis-a-vis that text. And to know what is in your mind is to exercise your mind, it's to think. Reading also can be a springboard for free association. I read a line, and like Marcel Proust, thinking of Madeleine's, you think about something else that's tangentially related, but you wouldn't have thought about otherwise if there hadn't been that springboard. So reading does many things to spur thinking.
Professor, you mentioned that reading has already been in decline. Does AI accelerate that trend, or could it potentially revive reading in new forms?
Let's start with the trend. And I'll just give you a few statistics so you can get a sense of things, and then a quotation from an American author that I think is very telling. Um, there is an examination for 15-year-olds called the PISA exam that's administered by the OECD to students around the world. And in the 2018 administration, you may say that's a while ago, but they drilled down in their questions on issues relating to reading. In 2018, when they asked those 15-year-olds, do you only read when you have to? 49% said, I only read if I have to. That is, almost half of them didn't read by choice. You compare that with when the same question was asked in 2009, and only 36% said, I only read when I have to, which meant the rest of them, almost two-thirds of them, said, I read because I want to. That's a problematic notion, a problematic result. In the United States, there's an exam that we euphemistically call the Nation's Report Card, which tests fourth graders, eighth graders, and 12th graders on reading skills and math skills. In 2023, only 14% of those eighth graders, so we're talking about people around age 14 or so, only 14% said they read for fun. In 1984, 35% said they read for fun. Surveys of American adults, 53% said they had read at least one book in 2023. Well, we didn't ask what book and how long it was, and was it a complex book, and did you actually finish the whole book? South Korea, which worries inordinately about the decline of reading among children and adults, found that in 2023, 43% of South Koreans had read at least one book. Okay, so that's a little lower than Americans, but compare that with 1994, when 87% of the adult population had read at least one book. That's a huge, huge change. I said I wanted to quote something from an American writer who's also a sociologist, who wrote a piece back in 2024 for the magazine The Atlantic. He had been doing some guest teaching. I believe it's at Yale University, but you'll understand the context when I read the quote. He said, I once asked a group of students on their final day at their prestigious university, which I believe was Yale. I asked them what book had changed their life over the previous 4 years. A long, awkward silence followed. Finally, a student said, you have to understand, we don't read like that. We only sample enough of each book to get through the class. What's happening increasingly in educational contexts, not just in the United States, in many other countries of the world, less so in India than some countries, I will note, but in many countries of the world, both East and West, is that we don't place much value on reading. And as a result, or maybe as a cause, society more generally is not placing that much value on reading. When digital books started to become popular, research scientists such as myself began studying how we read them compared with how we read print. And it's pretty clear that statistically, not for everybody, not all the time, but statistically, we read them meaning digital books, more quickly and with less comprehension and less depth and less analysis than when we read print. Especially this is true for long form. So if you have a passage that's 200 words long, print versus digital, it may not make that much difference. Once you get up to 500 and 1,000 words, it starts to make a difference. My colleagues and I have done some studies of what faculty think about and what their practices are with regard to assignments. And many faculty are assigning less reading now than they used to. One of the reasons being the students weren't doing the reading. So why are we fooling ourselves to make these assignments when it wasn't happening anyway? You asked about whether AI is accelerating this trend and what we might do if that's the case. And does AI do anything positive? Well, we'll get to some of the AI issues in a moment, but let me talk for a second about the acceleration. We know that artificial intelligence tools, large language models, and newer models that have reasoning capabilities built into them and so forth, so-called foundation models, they put an emphasis on speed and efficiency of completing a task. Reading, I know there's something called speed reading, but put that aside. Reading is not something that historically we've tried to do really quickly. And one of the reasons we haven't is we ponder over words, we reread things, we think about them, we agree, we disagree, we don't understand. AI understands everything, or so it claims, and it moves really, really quickly. So the value that we place on AI tools working quickly and efficiently conflicts with human values for reading, especially when it comes to reading for pleasure or for psychosocial development, which we can talk about in a few minutes. So before we talk about AI positively reviving reading, I wonder about the foundational assumptions about why we like AI so much in the first place, because they're at odds with why we read.
Professor, what do we lose cognitively and culturally if fewer people engage directly with the long form text?
It's important to ask what it means to be part of a literate culture. A culture where not everybody reads all the time, not everybody writes, but there's the potential, and the culture itself is built upon many literate assumptions. That is, literacy is embedded in the things that we find to be important culturally. So it undergirds most religions, it undergirds most employment, it undergirds democratic government. What living in a literate society does for us is it gives us a precious opportunity to share in the lives of other people. Some are alive, some are dead, some were real people, some were only imagined, but it expands our opportunities beyond just the people we encounter ourselves individually. Come now to the cognitive issues. Many years ago, there was a classicist named Eric Havelock who wrote a book called Enter Plato. And in it, he argued, rightly or wrongly, that the development of the Greek alphabet made possible a kind of logical thinking, which in turn made possible Greek philosophy. Well, whether that argument is true or not, what is true is the argument that he laid out about how reading a written text gives us opportunities to follow through the logic of the text by rereading, by comparing text, and having therefore an impact on the way that we think. So let's jump ahead now for a moment to what we are starting to learn about the impact of artificial intelligence on our use of cognitive skills. And I'll just cite three studies. The first is one that was largely done by Microsoft Research, asking a group of working professionals where they used AI tasks and how they thought use of those AI systems was impacting their own cognitive abilities. And what they reported was that they felt they were putting forth less cognitive effort, doing less critical thinking, their term, when they were using those tools than when they had to use their own brains. Okay, that's study one. Study two was done in the Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Boston area, Boston, Massachusetts area, centered at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And what they had done very creatively was use EEG brain scanners to compare how much cognitive effort in the sense of activity of the brain was being exerted when people were using a large language model to write a text for them, when they were using a search engine to generate links that they would then have to read themselves, or when they were just using their brain, what's called the brain-only condition. And what it showed is there was less brain activity when you were using particularly a tool like ChatGPT to do the writing for you. But what was really interesting was the follow-up questions of what did the participants in the study feel about the text that was produced if you had a tool such as ChatGPT doing or at least helping with the writing as opposed to using your own brain. And what people reported was if they wrote themselves rather than using AI, they had a higher sense of ownership. They also were better able to quote from the resulting work because they had written it themselves. Not surprising they should remember it. And the quality of the essays they came up with was better. Then there was a reading study done at the University of Pennsylvania that basically asked a large language model to do some reading and come up with a letter. I'll describe what the letter was in a second, compared with a condition where students were using a computer to do a search where they had to then read the links themselves. The goal was to write an advice letter to a friend based on the information they got, either from what the LLM wrote as a summary or what they came up with when they had read the links that the search had generated. With using AI overviews, because it was a Google search they did, what the participants reported is they spent less effort, they learned less, they wrote less insightful essays, and these were judged by external judges, and they also had less of a sense of ownership of what they wrote than when they had even used just the search tools. Okay, so now let's turn to what's going on in the brain when we read and what that has to do with cognition. We know from a lot of interesting research that the brain changes because the brain actually is plastic. It can evolve over time with mental activity. We know that when you learn to read, your brain changes. That happens when kids learn to read at a traditional age. It's also true of adults who were non-literate to begin with. In fact, one of the studies done was in India, where women, I think it was women who had never learned to read, as adults were taught to read, and you could measure the changes that happen in their brain. Going to another perspective, studies have been done of people who are older, so in their 60s and 70s and 80s, and the people who read books, not magazines or newspapers, but whole books, showed delays in cognitive decline compared with people who did not read long form texts. But there are also the psychosocial changes that come about from reading that I think are very important for us to remember. There's personal development. Back, particularly in the 19th century, although the term predates that by a number of decades, there was this idea of, the German term was Bildung, which basically meant a type of education that happens when you learn from others, but also from reading, um, to to develop what your values are, what your aesthetics are, what your goals are, and to do that to a certain extent by reading. In English, so there was this development of a kind of novel called the Bildungsroman or the Bildung novel. In English, we tend to call that the coming of age novel, where you follow the development of someone who goes through the trials and tribulations of life, and you learn how somebody else, imagined or real, doesn't matter, but somebody else managed to address those issues. When he or she falls down, how does he or she pick himself up or herself up, and so forth? What lessons in life did they learn? There has been a therapy called bibliotherapy that actually goes back a couple of hundred years, where starting in Wales and then in England, there are actual therapeutic regimens whereby people are assigned to read a book, to get it from the library, and to have that book matched to the sorts of difficulties that individual is going through as a way of helping to learn how to address life's challenges. So there are lots and lots of ways in which, if we didn't read, we would lose out cognitively and personally.
Professor, could AI become a reading assistant rather than a replacement? And what would responsible collaboration between humans and AI look like?
Let's start with the predecessors of AI as a potential reading assistant. Particularly in the United States, there have for many decades been study notes, particularly on pieces of literature, that students have resorted to, often instead of reading the originals. The process started back in 1958 when a man named Clifton Keith Hillegas developed some study guides for plays of Shakespeare. And these came to be known as Cliff's Notes. Okay. The idea of Cliff's Notes, and you'll find this today if you go to the website for Cliff's Notes, the idea was to make this a form of what I call co-reading. That is, do the reading yourself, but maybe get some ideas of what's important in the text, particularly if you're having trouble understanding the text or you want to refresh your memory. Did you understand things well? So if you go to the website today, it says, use Cliff's Notes literature guides as a study aid, a tool to help you understand literature. Most people use Cliff's Notes by reading a chapter of the book or an act of the play, and then reading the corresponding section in the Cliff's Notes. Alternatively, read the entire book or play and then review with Cliff's Notes. I have never met a single student in all my decades of teaching who actually does what this suggests is a good procedure. Instead, they don't read the book and they use Cliff's Notes. Okay. AI, by the way, can do exactly the same thing for them. You don't even have to purchase or find somewhere Cliff's Notes or Spark's Notes, or there are many, many versions of the same thing. But there are other kinds of co-reading that I think are appropriate for us to use AI for. One of the examples I like to give is creating a dramatis personae, that is a list of the characters in a Russian novel like Anna Karenina. One of the challenges for people who don't know Russian and Russian culture is coping with the names. There's so many characters, but there are also alternative versions of names. And sometimes Tolstoy uses one version and sometimes another version, and you get really confused. Is this the same person we're talking about? So if you had, as a Shakespearean play does, and some other plays, and even a few novels have, a list of who are the characters, so you can keep that handy and help guide your reading, I think that would be a wonderful use of AI. There are other kinds of uses that I swear by, including translation. There's so many things I would love to read and can't because they're in languages I don't know or don't know well. And I know the translations are not perfect, but they're incredibly better than anything that I would come up with myself. A third area is adapting the language level of an original text. Maybe adapting it for younger readers, maybe for people who are non-native speakers of a language who don't have a wide vocabulary or don't have complex grammatical skills. You can also use AI to adapt a text by varying the language style. So let me give you a couple of examples that I had some real fun with when I was writing the book ReaderBot. At that time, I was using Claude 3.5, and I asked it to write a 200-word summary of King Lear, but to do it in several different ways. The first way I asked was use very sophisticated vocabulary. And if I were teaching a group of students, I might want to use this tool as a really good vocabulary lesson to say, here you can learn a lot of vocabulary in a context that you might want to learn anyway, namely reading King Lear. So here's the first set of sentences from my request to Claude 3.5 to give a 200-word summary of King Lear using very sophisticated language. Claude 3.5 wrote, King Lear, a monarch of considerable sagacity, yet afflicted by hubris, orchestrates a fateful partition of his dominion among his three daughters, Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia. The allocation was to be predicated upon their respective declarations of filial devotion. Okay, lots of words there to study. I then asked Claude 3.5 to please write a summary for a 12-year-old. And here are the first two sentences. King Lear, an aging king, decided to split his kingdom among his three daughters, Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia. He asks each of them to tell them how much they love him. Okay, a 12-year-old could handle that. Then I asked, write a humorous summary. And here's the beginning of what Claude 3.5 wrote. Picture this. A cranky old king decides to play a game of who loves daddy most with his three daughters. The prize? Just a casual third of a kingdom. So you can have a lot of fun with this. You can use it for educational purposes. I'm not against using AI, in this case, in the educational context, but we have to be mindful of when we use it and what our rationales are.
Professor, in education, how should institutions respond if students increasingly depend on AI tools to read and interpret material?
Pragmatically, there are a number of classrooms, at least within the United States, that are already making changes in how they go about the educational process. One is, believe it or not, to have students do their reading in class. Now, that takes a lot of time, but then you know that students are reading because the book is in front of their nose, and sometimes a screen, but preferably a book. Sometimes the reading is done aloud, and there's all kinds of evidence that reading aloud has cognitive benefits. So, these are university level classes that are reading things aloud. Think about it. Similarly, when it comes to the writing issues, there are a growing number of faculty members who say, we're going to do our exams in class. We're going to write the essays in class. In fact, we're going to do it by hand, which makes it hard for the faculty to read their handwriting because they haven't had writing practice forever. Sometimes a computer is used with the internet being blocked. So there are some pragmatic tools, whether these are going to be appropriate or not for large classes, who knows? But people are already on the lookout for ways to approach the problem. But I think even more importantly is the kinds of things we talk about with students and the kinds of practices that we, the non-students, are engaged in. We need to talk more in class, as well as with our sons and daughters, about why we read. Not just go read, it's important, or come back and tell me that you finished the assignment or didn't do the assignment and I'll scold you, or you have to do 20 minutes of reading a day, or else you won't get dessert at supper. But why do we read? Because there are lots of reasons and we can articulate them. And students understand a lot more about the importance of those reasons. But if we don't tell them we believe in them the reasons, then why should students think we do? We also need to talk about the role of first radio and then television and now digital media in substituting for long form writing because they have had an impact in how we have come to devalue long form writing. And unless we understand this, unless we voice it, it's no fault of the students if they say, well, I know how to read and I read the stuff that AI generates. So what's wrong with that? We need to be aware that, particularly in the United States, the amount of reading that we are assigning to students is diminishing. For a number, probably for 20 years now, at least in the United States, there are faculty members who say, well, instead of writing a research paper or a final essay, you could make a movie, or you could interview someone, or you could do a podcast, or whatever, instead of producing writing. And it's not that these other media can't be useful, but if you diminish the amount that we're asking people to read and then write, of course, students will feel that reading and writing are not that important. A second thing we need to be honest about is very few students see their parents reading. I know parents are busy, and I know parents are on their phone sometimes as much as their kids are. They, Students also don't see their teachers reading. It's one thing for the students to say, now you must complete your assignment. But if you don't see reading as a value that your teachers have, why should you take it as a value for yourself? So I think we need to address those issues rather than simply chastise students for not completing reading assignments.
Professor, is there a danger that AI curated reading could narrow our exposure to diverse perspectives, creating a kind of intellectual echo chamber?
We have to ask ourselves, what is in the data set that the large language model is drawing upon? Who did the writing? What kinds of values did the people who were doing the writing that's now made its way into the data set have? We also have to be aware that for many of the commonly used large language models, there are sycophantish responses to prompts to try to get you to use the tool more and more because it's like an echo chamber for the things that you want it to tell you how to do. Okay. Interestingly, there's a new study that was just posted that shows that large language models tend to take the Western perspective on a lot of value issues, particularly having to do with valuing the individual as opposed to valuing the group. So the study asked participants in a number of countries around the world, including India, about what their views were on arranged marriages, what their duties were to their families, who held authority in the workplace. The paper was called When AI Speaks, Whose Values Does It Express? And what the study found was that if somebody in India was asking in English those questions of a large language model, the kinds of answers it got were very individual based, as opposed to being more group and family tradition based, which is much more characteristic of a country such as India. And then if you put the queries into the language of, in the case of India, one of the languages of the country that the participants were from, the values tended to be more representative of that country's values than it had been if you asked in English. So the simple answer to the question is yes, AI as writer, and then we read what it has written, can lead us to believe that certain values are important, even if in that particular culture where the person is asking, from which the person is asking the question, wouldn't hold those values. So it can be very culturally upsetting. Okay. A second issue is more and more of the text that we read online is not generated by humans. Initially, it's generated by AI. The studies that have been done suggest that the vocabulary in this so-called synthetic text that is generated by AI has more limited vocabulary and grammar than text that would be generated by humans. So one of the real challenges is what are we going to be thinking about if the text that increasingly we are reading is not human generated, but AI generated with the kinds of limitations that AI generated text has been proven to have. There's an English professor at the University of Maryland here in the United States named Matthew Kirschenbaum who came up with the term textpocalypse. Like an apocalypse, but it's with text, arguing that the more and more that AI is used for generating text, the more we as humans will, number one, not be able to tell whether it was AI generated or human generated. That's already true. But then the question is, will we even care? And if we don't care, then our standards for what literacy could do for us have diminished to our own detriment.
Professor, before we wrap up, one final question. Looking ahead, what habits or skills should individuals consciously preserve to ensure that human readings remain a meaningful part of our lives?
To answer that question, I'd like to quote from a lecture that was then published as an article by a man named Charles Yu. The article was called "Don't Call It Intelligence." And Yu wrote, AI writes for us, reads for us, thinks for us. It replaces our voice with its own, except that AI doesn't have a voice. It's lip syncing ours. What I fear is that we're losing the ability to tell the difference between our voice and the machines. Or worse, losing the will to argue that there is one, that there is a difference. And then he goes on to say, the danger isn't that we're overestimating AI, it's that we're underestimating ourselves. So what would be my advice? It's not to underestimate our own cognitive potential as human beings. What we need to do is ask ourselves what we have to do to cultivate that potential. Since the emergence of literate societies, beginning about 5,500 years ago, reading has increasingly become a vital tool for human cognitive and psychological and social development. The more that we lean on AI to do the reading for us, the more we shortchange our human selves.
Thank you, Professor Naomi, for joining us for this thought-provoking conversation. As we navigate a world where AI is not just writing for us, but increasingly reading on our behalf, it's worth pausing to reflect on what we choose to remain as deeply human. Thank you once again for sharing your insights from your book. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for having me.